But welcome everybody, thanks to RAI. I'm just going to tell you briefly who we have here. I'm going to make a few remarks and then I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves a little bit more fully. And so on the panel today, we have Gunvor Jonsson, social researcher and anthropologist from SOAS, who works as a senior research officer in the Department for Business and Trade. We have Christine Saab, who's a documentary filmmaker and assistant producer with experience in TV and film, and she's a graduate of the National Film and TV School, but she also has a BA in social anthropology from the School of African and Oriental Studies. We have Justin Kenrick, who's a senior policy advisor at the Forest Peoples Programme, and he's from the University of Glasgow. We have Nicole Elon, a senior design researcher at TPK Impact, and she has an MSc in social and cultural anthropology from the University of Amsterdam. And we have Ranmali Jayawardena, audience and interpretation lead at the Museum of London. She works with a number of museums and she has a PhD from Belfast University. So I'll come back to them in just a moment, but I'm just going to make a few remarks. It's a long time since I wrote the first edition of What Anthropologists Do. That must be about 15 years ago. And I started by saying out that one of the main reasons people find anthropology is a bit of a mystery and understanding human behavior is that it's actually useful in addressing just about any topic or issue. So there's really almost nothing that you can't do with anthropology. And I also drew attention to some of the stereotypical representations of anthropologists that frighten people's parents when they say they want to go to university and study anthropology. And they still pop up in the film and media sometimes, imagining anthropologists as bearded, sandal-wearing eccentrics living for years in remote areas and going a bit bonkers in the desert. And so I think the best, in the last decade, however, representations of anthropology have moved on a bit, and they've started to recognize that while productive collaboration with Indigenous people remain centrally important to the discipline, anthropologists today are working in just about every area in many, many different ways. And our panelists today are going to give you some insights into those. And the broadening interests of anthropologists are also revealed in the range of subdisciplinary areas that have emerged, which range from evolutionary biological anthropology through social and cultural work, material culture, environmental, forensic anthropology, cognitive anthropology, and so forth. And within all these areas, there's all kinds of scope for work in varied kinds. For example, my own research, which focuses very much on people's relationships with water, has been mostly in Australia and New Zealand. And it includes ethnographically examining people's relationships with water, catchment areas. It works on water ownership and the impact of privatizing the water industry, which we're all living with today in the UK. And it also things like working with UNESCO and the UN in formulating international legislation or creating educational work about people's very different cultural relationships with water. I also do advocacy for Indigenous communities on water rights and land rights, and get involved in international debates about human and non-human rights to water and things like personhood of rivers, etc. So there's a whole set of very varied things that you can do, even within a specific focus of anthropology. Now, as this implies, that includes both theoretical contributions and practical application. And some people define the latter as applied anthropology. But if you've read what anthropologists do, and I hope that you all either have or will, you'll find that I don't use that term at all. Because I don't make the distinction. In fact, I went to quite some lengths to avoid it because I feel it doesn't really help our discipline to categorize people as being sort of inside, proper academics doing theory, or alternatively outside the ivory tower doing engaged anthropology, or in some cases seen as more practical and applied anthropology. So I think I would just call us all anthropologists and recognize that most people, even in universities, move between doing work that you might describe as application and making contributions to theory, and that theory actually underpins our analysis, whatever we're doing, whether it's inside a university or not. So, working across so many areas, what distinguishes anthropology from other disciplines? Primarily, I think its identity as a discipline rests on its particular theories and its methods. And over the last century, anthropology has developed a body of very illuminating theories, which we would think about as a toolkit, if you like, for understanding human behavior. And there's a lens, it gives us a lens through which you can go into any situation and kind of figure out what is going on with people. But it's also differentiated by the emphasis that it places on in-depth ethnographic research, by which I mean long-term fieldwork within communities, participant observation, interviews, and multiple subsidiary methods of collecting data, for example, through photographic elicitation and so forth. And this creates a holistic ethnographic portrait of a particular group and a key explanatory background for understanding very much more specific research questions. So although there's still some quite conservative anthropologists who think that classic ethnographic research is de rigueur, applications of anthropology have broadened quite a bit in the last 2 decades. And some of us have embraced a more interdisciplinary collaborative approach and have found it very useful to see the perspectives of other disciplines in our work, while still making foundational use of anthropology itself. I've also discovered through that kind of collaborative work, and because I ran an interdisciplinary institute at Durham University for 10 years, that anthropology provides a very excellent foundation for working with others across the academic spectrum. Why is that? Because I think our training provides an awful lot of skills in cultural translation, which also comes comes handy when we want to engage with other disciplinary worldviews and values and languages and priorities. So we have the skills to translate between disciplines. And, you know, when I work in a river catchment with Indigenous people and miners and pastoralists and recreational water users, it's not so very different to then work with a lot of other disciplines in that catchment area and translate between them. And in many ways, I really think that having interdisciplinary projects led by anthropologists with our very capacious theoretical frameworks and our cultural translation would be a very good idea, rather than having them led by STEM scientists who tend to want us to fit into a much narrower view of what they're doing. So it doesn't always happen that way, unfortunately, but I think that it would be good if it did. My final comment is about scale and comparison. Anthropologists have traditionally been seen to work at a local level, either with place-based societies or specific minority groups and so forth. But of course, every ethnography feeds into a larger scale meta-discourse, if you like, in which the discipline is intrinsically comparative. So we have all these wonderful localized place-based studies feeding upwards, if you like, into a more international and sometimes interdisciplinary discussion about how things work. And this comparison is essential if we're to continue to develop our understanding of humankind, and practically necessary if ethnography is going to contribute to larger scale questions, for example, about policy or international legislation and so forth. And we now recognize that all social analysis, whether by European anthropologists or indigenous scholars, is at least implicitly comparative. And I think it's healthy to be open about that. I'm obviously keen on this. If you've looked at any of my work, you'll know that even in the early 1990s, my doctoral work involved a comparison between Indigenous people in Northern Australia and the pastoralists and their relationships with the same land. And over the decades, my work on water beings, the deities that personify the powers of water, has turned into a massive comparative and interdisciplinary study looking at what happens to them over time and how this reveals changing relationships with water and how we've moved from worshipping nature to basically exploiting and creating an environmental crisis. So the potential for useful comparative work is very exciting. And a century ago, there was very little data to work with, but it's absolutely brilliant now because there has now been so much ethnography done around the world that it is fantastic to have a vast data set in which you can also draw on the ethnography of your colleagues. So you can use your own ethnographic experience, but also collaborate with colleagues around the world. So anthropology provides an opportunity to work on any topic, in any area, on multiple scales and in many different ways. And our panel is going to provide you now with some examples about their own experiences. So who would like to go first? Can we have a volunteer, please? I'll just pick on Gunvar. Thank you. Thank you, Gunvar. You go ahead.
No problem. Thank you very much, Veronica. That was actually really interesting. I'll definitely have to read your book now. So hello, everyone. I'm Gunvar Johnson, however you want to pronounce it. I currently work at the UK Department for Business and Trade. I've just been in that role for a couple of months. I've got a long career behind me, and I thought maybe for the purposes of just kind of giving you a 5-minute snapshot of what I've done, I can sort of speak to my pre-PhD, post-PhD, and then now sort of post-academia. So I really started out my anthropological explorations in South Africa, where I did my undergraduate degree or degrees. I did an honours degree as well, which led me to do a bit of field work on HIV/AIDS. And I published a paper with my supervisor. That was a lot of fun. So I was completely hooked on anthropology. I, after about 5 years in South Africa, I went back to Denmark, where I was born, and I enrolled in a postgraduate degree in anthropology, which also led me to do a bit of field work. So I spent about half a year in Mali in West Africa, doing research on migration aspirations and immobility. And this led me to a very exciting post at the University of Oxford. I got hired to work on something called the African Perspectives on Human Mobilities program. Spent about 3 years working with lots of African researchers, kind of learning about their research into migration, which was a massive gap in the migration studies kind of field. And I was working on the Oxford side in an interdisciplinary team. People were kind of from all kinds of disciplines, but I was the only anthropologist there, which was fun. And so I was kind of a bit of a participant observer in my own department, I suppose, as kind of an insider outsider. So there I kind of got familiar with more kind of quantitative research and more sort of policy oriented research as well, I suppose. But really very heavily on my anthropological skill set as well, kind of working with African colleagues in a kind of I suppose, decolonization kind of ethos, although that was before that word became kind of widely known. So after nearly 5 years in this post, I kind of realized if I want to keep doing this, I really need a PhD. So I enrolled at SOAS in Anthropology, School of Oriental and African Studies, and did my PhD there, going back to West Africa, but this time I went to Senegal, which is Mali's neighboring country. Had a great time looking at urban displacement, market traders, and so on. I've just published it as a book, if anyone's interested in hearing about that, but that's not the focus of today. But really, yeah, had a great time with the PhD. In the last year of my PhD, I then returned to University of Oxford as a lecturer in migration studies. And I did that for about 3 years, had a child in between and a bit of a career break. And then I ended up going back to SOAS now as a program director of the Migration and Diaspora Studies MA, as well as the Anthropology of Development MA. So juggling 2 MA degrees as program director was quite a lot of work, having a 2-year-old baby on the side as well. And then did that until 2020, which was a massive transformative year for me. We had COVID hitting, of course. My contract came to an end, and I was really struggling to find a job. I ended up getting a part-time job with the Open University, doing research on market traders with a big European consortium. That was a lot of fun, having the freedom to do that when everyone else was stuck at home. I actually did some field work. But I got to a point after a couple of years where I felt like I just want some stability. I want a permanent job, whether that's inside or outside academia. And I started kind of spreading my net very widely and just did loads of job interviews. And I landed a job in government social research in the civil service, which was completely foreign to me. I have to be very honest. I'd only spent my whole career in academia. And here I am. The first job I had was at the Office for National Statistics. So I helped to produce their statistics on migration. I did that for about a year. And then I started this new job at Department for Business and Trade. I'm a senior researcher there, and I work in monitoring and evaluation, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But that goes very well, especially with the qualitative research skill set that we have as anthropologists, I would point out. And so I think evaluation is really a career to consider for graduates at all kinds of levels. But I'll stop there because I can keep going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anna. You've wonderfully underlined the flexibility of anthropology. Can I ask Christine to go next?
Hi there, absolutely. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. So my name is Christine Saab. I'm a documentary filmmaker. And yes, I studied social anthropology at SOAS. I've worked sort of permanently for different production companies, making documentaries and films and series. But I currently work freelance. So I work on a number of projects and a number of topics for the BBC, for Channel 4, for Netflix, etc. So that's a very quick kind of introduction. I think I just wanted to say sort of just at the top of this, that I think, you know, this is just a really great kind of session to be part of, because I think, like, even now, sometimes I think to myself, like, what is it that anthropologists do? And certainly I think when I came out of my BA in social anthropology, I mean, I immensely enjoyed my time and learned so much, but I have to say I was, you know, kind of I had a lot of questions about what it is that I could do next. So before I kind of start talking about what it is that I do now on a day-to-day basis, I thought it might be just a bit useful to kind of do a whistle-stop tour of how I got to what I'm doing now. When I came out of doing my undergraduate degree, I ended up working for a market research company called Ipsos, which they do a lot of kind of quantitative and qualitative research. And they had a small video ethnography team, essentially, which would, it's sort of ethnographic research. It's not sort of, I would say, as robust as academic ethnographic research, but essentially we would take a brief from a client who, for example, a good example might be kind of, you know, the government is trying to understand the obesity rates in the UK. And so that brief would come to us, and we would spend time and film with families across the UK and make draft report for them, but then also make kind of these short documentary-like films for them. So that's what I was doing for a couple of years. But I was essentially working with a lot of documentary filmmakers who did this sort of on the side, which is eventually sort of what led me to what I do today, which is making documentaries. So I would say I sort of fell into it. In terms of what I do now, I work in development. and in production. So what that essentially means is in development, I come up with ideas for documentaries. But I think I wanted to kind of just touch on what Veronica was saying about cultural translation, because I really think that comes into the work that I do. You know, with developing ideas for films, for documentary films, I think a lot of it is having a quite an understanding of what's going on in the world today. So not just sort of what's in the news, but I think very much, you know, what are people kind of discussing amongst family and friends? What are people talking about at the pub? What are people posting on TikTok? What are people talking about on Reddit? What are their concerns? Where do they think you know, how do they feel about where the world is going? And it's kind of taking all of that and sort of getting a sort of understanding of that, and then trying to translate that into a film. And yeah, so I take those things, kind of try to package it into a film that's both engaging and digestible, and then try to sort of sell that idea to different broadcasters or streamers. And once they decide to commission that idea, then we do the fun bit. Actually, the development is also fun, but then we go into actually making the film, which I think is also very much about kind of cultural translation. It is a bit difficult to sort of explain what I do, because I'm not sort of just a camera person, for example, but as a director and an assistant producer, I kind of am involved in all aspects of making the film, which is finding the locations where we will film, finding the participants or contributors to actually be in the film, interviewing experts so that we have a better understanding of the landscape of the film that we're trying to make. And after we've kind of filmed everything, then we start working in post-production. So we work with an editor and a sound designer and a composer, and you know, with this kind of singular vision of trying to craft this story. I hope I don't know, I hope that sort of makes sense, but maybe it would be helpful if I gave some examples of what I've made and what I've worked on, because it is quite broad. So the last thing I was working on was a series for the BBC, a Bruce Perry series. So Bruce Perry is he is a filmmaker and a presenter, and he's most well known for sort of spending time with Indigenous communities around the world and sort of seeing what their life is like. So essentially my job was to speak to different anthropologists, NGOs, academics, and try to find communities that Bruce Perry would be able to spend time with and for us to make a series out of. So that's the sort of latest thing I've worked on, but I've also worked on a feature film that was about am I over time?
Sorry, I'm sure but I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you later, because it all sounds very exciting. But I think we need to we'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Also see some hands up, but question time is a bit later in this event, so for Mike. But can we pass on to Justin now?
Yeah, thanks, Veronica. Yeah, really happy to be here, and very happy with your introduction that was kind of suggesting to me that applied anthropology isn't quite a term that fits. And I guess that's true for me in that I feel like anthropology is a practice, it's a discipline, it's a kind of a way of being in the world. So I'm not suggesting this is what everybody else thinks, just this is how I approach it. And I'll just get rid of my full face in my face so I can see. There we go. I've got rid of myself. Yeah, so I work for Forest People's Programme, but when I finished doing my PhD up here in Edinburgh, I was immediately working, trying to reach drug users in the borders here for the NHS who are not wanting to be reached by the NHS. So that felt like, anthropologists get given jobs that can't be done. And the next job was working for Edinburgh City Council, working with sex workers to try and understand whether the City Council should be funding an organisation that was trying to rescue women from the streets or fund an organisation that was trying to support women in terms of their work on the streets. And there was a really strong split in terms of how these people's view were being seen. And the job after that was working in Glasgow on domestic violence, trying to see how to support those engaged without stigmatizing, but without avoiding the issue. So I'm just giving those as 3 examples of where anthropologists, to me, get brought in because the situation is kind of impossible according to the usual paradigm, which kind of imposes a solution from above. It's very much about building relationships. And I take this from kind of Michael Carruthers' understanding of anthropology as practice, as a kind of as being about valuing others. And when you engage in ethnographic fieldwork, you're trying to value people who you may not value, who you may find difficult, but you're trying to establish relationships of trust and relationships of value. And I also like his point that that valuing of others that's core to anthropology gives you a kind of moral basis for action in the world too. So it's not just that you're valuing people in the abstract, or we should value that culture or this. It's actually you're saying that valuing others matters. And so you can object when other people don't value others. So there's actually a moral and political basis for intervention in the world for anthropology. Cultural relativism doesn't lead you into a place where you can't do anything, but to a place where you go, we need to value each other. And when you see people not being valued, you object. So I haven't had a career. I'm a senior policy advisor at Forest People Programme, so that looks like I have. I guess I've been an activist all my life. I mean, just seeing the world and seeing that we need to do something about the kind of state of things. And I'm wondering what a career means in this age with the kind of ecological consequences that are unraveling right now, that until a few years ago, people would talk about as if they were somewhere down the line and we could do something about it at some point in the future. But actually, we can see things really unraveling. So I'm wondering what a career means for people at this stage, and really whether you need to be thinking about the best intervention that you can make rather than necessarily what career can I have. But that's just, as I say, it's just my approach, not anybody else's. So I came across anthropology at university. I'd never heard of it before. As soon as I came across it, I went, yes, perfect. Like the everyday matters. Just the everyday is extraordinary. Just being alive is phenomenal. And people do it really differently. And the way you do it is different the way I do it. And we all kind of get caught up in ways of thinking, personally and culturally, as if these ways of thinking were the truth, the ways of thinking about ourselves, the ways of thinking about the world. And they aren't the truth, they're a truth. I'm giving you my truth just now. It won't necessarily match yours, but it's just so how can we communicate our approaches really clearly in a way that is clear about how we're distinct, but allows for an engagement rather than a conflict to happen. So I was amazed when I came across anthropology. I then went off to investigate logging companies in Africa because I was really concerned about what was happening to the rainforest and the people there. And then I needed some funding to do that because nobody would fund me. So I thought, I'll get some PhD funding. So I got a PhD, got funding to do a PhD. And then, of course, it was anthropology, so I couldn't help. But actually, I didn't mean to finish the PhD. I meant to just take the money and run to be able to do the activist work. But of course, anthropology is wonderful. So I did finish the PhD and then went back into that work of trying to support forest communities in Africa, which is my job is trying to support communities to stay on their land when they're being thrown off by large corporations, by large conservation organizations like WWF or WCS, by governments, by all sorts of well-meaning or not well-meaning people who see the need to remove people from their lands because you should really fit into the dominant system of being separate from nature in order to either exploit it or protect it. But you shouldn't see yourself as part of nature, which is, of course, what we all actually are as breathing bodies. That's what we are. So when we think we're distant from nature, we're distant from ourselves. So I went into that kind of work in terms of supporting forest peoples, and then just coming back to an issue around children that was mentioned earlier. I then had kids, a bunch of kids, and I had to stop traveling off to Africa all the time. So I got a job lecturing for 8 years. And so I got a proper job for 8 years, which was very good. I love teaching. I don't like institutions, and institutions in our society are so undemocratic. It's phenomenal. I'm just amazed. We have this little gap of democracy, and then we have a whole range of hierarchical organizations where people above you kind of are supposed to be nice, and they can be nice, but basically you're kind of told what to do. And I find it a very bizarre system. But I work with egalitarian hunter-gatherers mostly, but also with pastoralists, so who have a very different approach to this. They definitely have leadership and so on, but it's a very different form of leadership. I should probably have stopped about 3 minutes ago, shouldn't I? But just the last bit. Oh, yes, my timer tells me to stop. So just to say, I took a job in academia for about 8 years, loved teaching. And what I found was students who'd come through, they'd go off to be nurses, to be teachers, to be social workers, whatever, and they were being anthropologists. If they'd really taken on board the fact that valuing others matters and insisting to those little kids or to other adults, whoever else, that valuing other people matters, and have the skills, the relationship skills, which you should be able to gain through ethnographic fieldwork, to be able to do that, then you're an anthropologist. I'll stop. Sorry, Veronica.
But
Very hard to hear you, Veronica. Sorry, very hard to hear you.
we'll move on to Nicole, if we may.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here on this panel. I'm Nicole Alliong. I'm originally from Vancouver, Canada, as you can probably hear from my voice, my accent, and I studied anthropology with a minor in biology, actually, from the University of British Columbia. It wasn't until several years later that I decided to pursue my master's in cultural and social anthropology at the University of Amsterdam. It was really great to hear Veronica's reflections at the beginning of what applied anthropology is, and even just now, just in listening to you talk, I'm taking my own notes about what a career is. Before I decided to pursue my master's, I, very similar to Christine, was fortunate to work at a small market research agency in Canada that works very closely with financial services and tech companies. So you might have heard some of them like Amazon or Fitbit and Nintendo. And the research that I did there was largely about helping them understand their customer base, their potential customers better. And fast forward to a number of years later, I now work at a company called TPX Impact, and we are a digital transformation consultancy. What does that mean? We work with organizations in the public sector to improve how they work and what they do. So what that looks like is supporting organizations like local government or central government, councils, nonprofits, charities, undergo kind of large scale change to adopting new technology, organizational change, maybe how they work, introducing new processes and policy, and tech solutions, digital solutions are just kind of part of that, of how we make that happen. So sometimes the solutions we come up with is so large scale in complexity or just the way that it actually works, large kind of complicated systems, we call that digital transformation because it's so monumental that just to market, it's really going from maybe what could be a very paper and pen type process to a new bespoke platform on how to do things, which hopefully brings across efficiency, fairness, equity, all those kind of good things. So as a design researcher, it's my job to plan and execute custom research projects that will answer the questions that we have in order to better design and improve the space that we're working with. So I call myself kind of a glorified people watcher. That's kind of the anthropological bit, which is lovely to do. These different research projects and looking at, how do people do their jobs, or how do they fill out an online form? What does that look like? Who are their colleagues? Who do they talk to? Who do they report to? If people go to a website, how do they find the information they're looking for? So it can be a very kind of digital space. Sometimes people call me a user researcher, which is kind of a term derived from a whole different thing. But for me, I love embracing anthropology. Applied anthropology was always going to be a very practical route I wanted to take. I actually considered multiple different streams of anthropology when I was in my undergrad. At one point in time, I went on an archaeological dig with one of my professors thinking I was going to do that. I designed my own course to do like, ancient DNA kind of research as well. Decided that I much prefer talking to real human beings that are nice, alive, and well than just completely locking myself in a laboratory looking at their old DNA and genetics, but still really cool. And I really loved the space of design and creatives. And around that time, there was different agencies kind of popping up like IDEO and people talking about design thinking. And I really thought it was interesting to look at design and who creatives are as a tribe, as a cultural group, coming from that anthropological lens. So that's where I focused actually my master's research. And after after a number of years working in industry and seeing what it was like to do this commercial business type market research, consumer insights, I went back to school and I really wanted to focus in the subdiscipline of design anthropology. So today I call myself a design anthropologist because one, I get the luxury of working with a multidisciplinary team of designers on the day-to-day. I work with service designers or content designers, but I also work with folks like web developers, business analysts. And when we talk about translating culture insights and what that means, like that's actually really pertinent to my day-to-day because I have to talk to a whole bunch of different people about like what's really going on here. What are people's motivations? What are the power dynamics? So I love looking at this from an anthropological lens to understand how we can design solutions better, but also a little bit of the anthropology of design. Like who do we treat as having the power to design certain systems? How do we treat this as a discipline or an industry going forward? So when I was doing my master's, I actually really focused on the idea of future making and the concept that sometimes there's groups of people, minority groups, that enter into an environment that was literally not designed for them at all. And I got to research alongside refugees and asylum seekers in the Netherlands who had creative backgrounds, very established creative portfolios, and understanding how they were trying to navigate amongst all the legal uncertainty that they were facing, actually fitting in, starting a new life in a country that, as I said, like was not designed for them, and what that looked like. So that's a little bit about me, and I will pass it back to Veronica.
Nicole, can I comment quickly? I think you made a really important point there about the fact that what anthropologists do is get under the surface and show what's going on, and that applies to social relations as well as material relations. So thank you so much for that. Ranmali, last but not least.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me today. I am Dr. Ranmali Jayawardena. My pronouns are she, her, and a quick visual description for anyone not seeing me today. I'm a South Asian woman with long black hair wearing a denim shirt. And as I was introduced at the beginning, I am audience and interpretation lead at Museum of London. Again, what does that mean? Essentially, interpretation is anything that a museum does that engages you with an object or a story. So in my day-to-day work, I work with curators, designers, learning specialists to write. I'm not quite sure if everyone is seeing the whiteboard at the moment. There we go. So in my day-to-day, as I say, I work with curators, designers, and learning specialists to write, yes, the obligatory text panels, but also to make films, soundscapes for galleries, touch objects and interactives, and games that help visitors explore like the objects and stories more deeply and make their own connections and discoveries in spaces as well. My unique responsibility in those groups is to always be thinking about and advocating for our audiences, and especially those who have been historically underrepresented in museum spaces. So those twin themes of storytelling and advocacy were also central to my anthropological studies. So I specialized in security and storytelling in Sri Lanka for my doctoral studies. So I explored how marginalized communities share experiences of violence in a militarized state. I explored how physical, emotional, cultural, and economic security were all necessary and therefore needed to be negotiated for by people in order to share their personal experiences of both conflict and non-conflict related harm in public spaces. Within the immediate aftermath of Sri Lanka's conflict, even this articulation just in itself was considered to be akin to a call for justice and therefore needed to be heavily mediated in order to avoid further repercussions. So I developed my interest in conflict resolution and social justice, studying at Queen's University in Belfast. And as you can imagine, Belfast was an ideal place to understand how people were enacting peace in real time. For my doctoral research, I worked a lot with grassroots non-governmental organisations. And actually, that's where I always envisaged my career to go. I always thought I was going to be working in the third sector or the charity sector. However, at the end of my PhD, I realised actually looking back, I'd already been doing it for 10 years, which felt more like the end of a career or a chance to segue rather than sort of the beginning of a career. So after lots of soul searching, I realised that museums really had been the constant in my life and the sort of area that I wanted to pursue. Moving to the sector was not easy. I come from a family of very aspirational immigrant nurses and carers. And so I always knew education through anthropology, through my anthropology studies, was going to be my greatest tool. But I didn't know what any sector looked like on the inside apart from the NHS. But what worked really well for me was in terms of timing. My research had always been, and my ethnographic practice had always been working closely with people who are advocating for themselves, NGOs and leaders and change makers who are looking to build mutually beneficial programs. And that's precisely the model that the heritage sector at the moment is actively seeking to pursue in order to reconcile with its own colonial foundations. So I began my career as community co-producer at the Thackeray Museum of Medicine in Leeds for the opening of their redevelopment. And then I moved to National Museums Liverpool to be community participation lead on their waterfront transformation project, redeveloping 5 sites, including, and the heart of which was the International Slavery Museum. At both museums, I led the co-production strategy, so outlining how the organisation can begin decentering themselves and start sharing power with underrepresented audiences. So my specialism has become developing, interpreting, and co-producing around complex subject matter and complex collections, from medicine to transatlantic slavery to ethnographic collections in themselves within large-scale museum transformations. For someone who is so anti-imperial, I often wonder how I ended up both being drawn to anthropology and then heritage. But fundamentally, I think I'm simultaneously both fascinated and repulsed by museums. And I continue to develop my working practice driven by that tension. Thanks.
I think that one of the things that has come through very clearly in a number of these little introductions is that focusing on human relations forces us to think very carefully about where we stand in terms of power relations and the morality of human engagement. So I think that this is something that you'll probably get from most anthropologists. It kind of comes with the territory. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to ask a series of questions, and I'll be looking for a couple of volunteers from the panel to answer them succinctly. I'm underlining the succinctly there, maybe, for not more than a minute, but I'd like to start off with a question about what actually drew you to anthropology in the first place and how that perception of the discipline has changed as you've gone through your careers. So if we could have somebody leap in and take that one on, that would be lovely.
I have a very short answer, so I will keep this very succinct. I think what initially drew me was the opportunity to learn about and to begin to understand cultures apart from my own. And there was this kind of, thought that like, wow, I could, travel and be here and meet new people and understand new things. But I think what's changed for me is the methodology and the theories underlining anthropology has made me more interested in my own communities and my own spaces, and sort of using those tools to understand the institutions that I work in, rather than kind of places that are sort of far away. Let's say it's more about kind of what's around me. So
that makes a very nice point, that a lot of people probably in the audience are here because they've traveled and run into very different cultural spaces and want to be able to make sense of it. And I think underlining that anthropology allows you to understand the really different ways in which people think and experience the world is absolutely key. Can we have another input on this question?
I'm happy to, if you like. Just I mean, I guess culture shock happens when you get home. It doesn't happen when you go somewhere that you're expecting to be strange. It's when you come back and realize that where you are was strange all along. And I guess that for me is what really drew me to anthropology in the first place, was just this putting in perspective of a culture which was so sure of itself, but was clearly teetering on the brink of something pretty drastic. And I was, as a teenager, I was really curious about that, and it didn't seem to be in the general zeitgeist, as it were, but I definitely felt it very strongly. So I was just very happy to meet anthropology and meet a place which seemed to have a perspective on that, although it didn't seem to think it did. Certainly, anthropologists that I encountered when I was studying it as undergraduate were saying it's not that interesting. You know, it's like, and I think what they meant by that was try and look at other societies in their own right rather than always bounce back to your own. So I think that's the danger. There's always a danger in any approach. The danger in my approach is I'm always bouncing back to look at our own society, and they were always saying, hey, actually value other societies in their own right too. So yeah, just throwing in my weakness here. Anybody else?
Weakness, I think being able to be reflexive about society is a strength, Justin. But I'll move on to the next question. I'm looking for a couple of examples of challenges in your career that have really benefited from an anthropological perspective that has illuminated them. Can we have a couple of those? All right, I'll provide one myself while you get a chance to think about it a little more. When I first went up to North Queensland to work with Aboriginal people and so forth, I immediately felt sympathy for the experience they'd had of being colonized and what that had brought to them. But actually having to work with the pastoralists as well allowed me to see why they were so aggressively racist and misogynistic and many other things as well. And it was the fear that underlined their precarity of their relationships with the land, their sense that their ownership was tenuous because they didn't have freehold, and also just the fear of how society was going to perceive them and wanting to be the heroes that settled this wild country and so forth. And I think sometimes the things that are most transformational are those that allow us to understand people we might otherwise be quite judgmental about.
Mm.
Yeah, I can jump in as well with, I'm not too sure this is a bit of a challenge, but something that has come up for me. So I mentioned how I'm a Canadian and I have done travel. I have had the experience of working in different contexts. But right now I've living in London and working on central government projects with TPX Impact. And one of the things that comes up is getting to actually apply that perspective, the kind of the emic and etic perspective, like they talk about that in anthropology, of the insider's perspective. And as a Canadian, I've had to quickly adjust into understanding what is the British landscape of politics, that there's these local authorities, there's devolved nations, there's centralized government. And as a researcher, as an ethnographer, getting to really lean into that a little bit in a way to my advantage and benefit, but also getting people to explain these very inherent cultural biases that exist of why do we do those things? Why do we operate and kind of go through these processes in a certain way? So it's challenging for myself a little bit in the actual work that I do and trying to quickly grasp what it is. That's not even touching on the fact that there's of course different language and kind of euphemisms that people use and slang to adopt, let alone just understanding how people are speaking, even though we're all speaking English. But kind of getting to, yeah, like I said, use that insider outside perspective and see, tie it into the work that's being done of how culturally significant those small details are, but being someone, especially in a role as a consultant, coming in to provide those perspectives and shed a little bit light on the things that maybe we just take for granted is something that's come up in my work.
Yes, I guess coming back, sorry, you go, Christine.
Okay, I'll go. I'll be quick. So I worked on a feature-length film, which will hopefully have a cinematic release sometime this year, about the Hijra community in India. And I think I was very much involved in not filming, but actually being the go-between between the people making the film and the funders of the film, who were very supportive of the kind of creative vision and also of the ethics of telling this story. But they were very much coming from a sort of a more Western perspective of let's say a transgender community. But so I think it was very much sort of my job to ensure to be a cultural translator and really explain that actually the Hijra community is very culturally specific to that region. And then so to sort of continuously be that translator, but still keep in mind that actually, keep in mind how to explain that to those who haven't heard of that community. Yeah, so I think just in that way, I think that sort of background in anthropology was helpful in terms of that challenge.
That's Veronica, I can't quite hear you. If that's still the case, then I wouldn't mind commenting on what you said earlier, Veronica, which was about understanding settler communities in Australia and the need to, which I mean, I've used your work a lot when I was teaching, I found it fantastic, but there's something about understanding people as different to not objecting to things they say. So being able to make this distinction between the need to deeply understand where people are coming from, but also to object when they don't value others. And it's getting that tension, that's a challenge. And I've had that recently working with women-led assemblies in East Africa, which we've been supporting communities, indigenous communities, to come together in terms of it's very patriarchal context, and supporting women to come together around that, but women to lead assemblies which have men in them too. So it's not a separate space, it's a shared space, but it's one where women are leading, where they're not tokenistically part of it, but they're in charge. It's a very so this is a current challenge for me. That's a very challenging context, because gender is often used in that context by development agencies and so on to be able to tell communities, well, you're patriarchal, so you don't have any rights, basically. I'm putting it very crudely, okay, but that's the subtext. So addressing gender and ensuring that women have the space that they should have to be able to lead in a way that doesn't also undermine the community has been a recent tension. But what I found is that people in the community as a whole, in the communities as a whole, respond really positively. So where I feared, because my focus is community land rights, I feared a focus on gender would undermine community land rights struggle. In fact, it's incredibly strengthened it, because of course, women obviously have such a total role, a central role, much more central than men in those societies, maybe in any society, but in those societies. And therefore, actually looking at the truth of that enables communities to come together in a far stronger way. So I guess that's just a challenge I'm suggesting, is either when you think there's not a tension, but there is, or when you think there will be a tension and there isn't, just keeping an eye on both of those. Pass back to you, sorry. Still can't hear you, Veronica, and I don't want to use it as an excuse to speak this time.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, we missed that, Veronica.
I was just going to say, that's an important point, I think, for all of us, because as a lifelong feminist, I often struggle in communities where women are not treated as I wish they were. But I think it also underlines the importance of our training in anthropology as a social science, which allows us to think analytically about the social power relations that we're observing and to write analytically about them, while still maintaining our own moral views about how power relations should, and that we have to somehow balance respect for cultural norms with issues like universal human rights and equality and so forth. And I think that it's important to underline that anthropology is a social science that gives us a level of detachment in order that we can make analyses that actually make those power relations very visible. Anyway, I'm going to move on to asking you, as anthropology continues to evolve, what key trends or areas of focus do you think are most important or are most likely to be the exciting areas in the future?
I'm happy to offer a few suggestions, just because I had to kind of explore that a little bit myself. And what I kind of have found is one thing is our ethnographic expertise, and that does seem to kind of be something that is starting to be on a lot of people's radar, not just sort of in the academic world where other disciplines are kind of starting to explore that, but I think sort of more broadly, I know certainly in government, we have now an ethnographic network, cross-Whitehall network, and we even have a cross Whitehall anthropology network. So it's there, like it's starting to have a presence. But so yeah, I think like ethnography is really kind of a method that is, you know, that's our strength. That's kind of our method almost. You could say, you know, that's the one we've really honed, and I think we should champion. That's something I would sort of recommend if you go out on the job market. That's your sort of USP, unique selling point, is that you have that kind of expertise. That's really something. And I mean, I see it like both in, you know, sort of in the applied world, like government research and NGOs and charities and so on, but also the sort of more commercial world of marketing research. And there's that interest in kind of ethnographic perspectives. So and I wonder now, with kind of artificial intelligence on the rise, and if that actually makes anthropology even more kind of, that's, I'm not sure a robot can do that. So that might make us very well positioned to kind of offer this alternative methodology. So that would be, yeah, my reflection. Might be others who want to come in.
Thoughts on that one?
I can jump in. Obviously, as I think we've touched on a lot, and you know, my work and the field of museums and heritage deals a lot with, is hopefully dealing more and more with decolonization. And I think that is the sort of key emerging thread of work that anthropology really brings to the sector, that is really exciting, because again, I feel like anthropology as a subject has been reckoning with its own colonial origins for decades. But it's only now that other industries, other sectors, other subjects that have been hiding this sort of their extractive or exploitative origins in plain sight are now being sort of forced to begin unpicking and reconciling with those. And I think anthropology gives us sort of like that leadway, because we've been doing it for so long. And then looking specifically at the museum context, there are very, very clear and very public cases of where our global cultures or ethnographic collections have been immorally brought into our museums and our sector. And there is a lot of light and a lot of work that has been done around that over the last few decades. And we're really like leading the way, I think, in terms of like anthropological collections. But I also think that global cultures is essentially just a litmus test. What anthropologists in museums are really doing is pushing the boundaries in terms of being like, yes, absolutely, we've been doing this work with our own collections for decades. We are ready to repatriate. We are ready for restitution. But what about your science collections? What about your natural history collections? These are all coming from the same origins. And so for me, anthropology really leads the way, and our colleagues have that real foundation, that understanding, that education that they can then apply and support other colleagues working in other sort of areas of the same institutions to sort of really move sort of really rapidly from that sort of like archetypal Victorian cabinet of curiosity of, you know, of taxidermy to actually displaying what this means in terms of empire and colonization. And a particularly good example of that is displays of power that University College London did at the Grant Museum, which curator Subhadra Das led on. But like, it's how we force entry into other spheres of knowledge that we know are sort of based on the same foundation as ours, but we have that sort of that precedent to really push forward for everything to be reckoned with in the same moment.
Yeah. Sorry, we can't hear you, Veronica, but I did want to, if there was time to just to chime in and plus one to everything that Romali was saying. I think it's so fantastic to hear again, like Justin talk about activism and decolonization. Personally, like I think sometimes anthropologists or the discipline of anthropology and any of social sciences can be like, as we turn the spotlight to our colonial history and being very critical of that, we can also are at risk, I think, from other people's perspectives of saying, that's what our specialty is, but what do we do forward and what do we go forward? And I just want to emphasize, I really think that there's an opportunity more for like futures thinking and futures research, and futures anthropology is an area that I'm really excited about right now, to really also consider the future in a critical lens as well, whose futures we're looking at, and how are we investing in radical visions of the future. And, you know, as we go and reconcile historical injustices, who's being valued in those conversations as well. And there's a bit of a bridge, but something that like ethnographic futures research has been brewing for about 50, 60 years. And I think the time is ripe right now, actually, to kind of look at that, of tying it in together into, someone posted, I think, a question in the chat about, you know, how do we sell ourselves as anthropologists? And it's taking all of the nuance that Ranmali just talked about and touched on, but also bridging it into, we can be also very future thinking, forward-looking, progressive discipline as well. And like, that shouldn't be shied away from at all either.
That's very helpful. We're going to stop running out of time shortly, so I'm going to jump to a last question. And this one is for all of you, briefly, to say, if you were asked for your advice to people thinking of studying anthropology, or to recent graduates in anthropology considering a career, what advice would you give to them?
I can jump in. I am a very, very big advocate for mentorships and creating your own networks. So my advice would be, if you're a recent graduate, or if you're looking to there is a particular area of like interest that you have, reach out to people. You will have no idea how like delightful it is to have a message come through from someone who wants to chat, who's interested in sort of like engaging your field. And it happens so rarely. So always reach out to people, make the most of informal and formal mentorships, and find your own networks. In the heritage sector, we have a wonderful network called Museum Detox, which is global majority colleagues from all across the world, like working in heritage, coming together to support each other, to work in solidarity, but also create, to be real change makers. So find your people, make an asset of the alternative skills that you bring to the table. It is really, really hard out there. Like, the job market is not, it's really tough. But I think that if an organization is really looking to diversify their employees, diversity of thought is such an important part of that. And as an anthropologist, like, the skills that you bring, the perspective that you bring is going to be so fundamental to like your unique input into that organization. So please do reach out to people, like find your networks, reach out to me if you're interested, through LinkedIn and Twitter if you're interested in heritage, but just make those personal connections, and before you know it, it'll be a group, it'll be a network, and it'll be an industry that you've created.
Can I just jump in there as well? So that's fantastic. And the other half of that for me is getting on with what you're passionate about. So what you're bringing is your commitment to an area, to something that you're interested in, something you've spent time with. And that can be, you know, something you've been doing voluntarily or whatever else. But so I totally agree with what you were saying, but it's also when people arrive having actually shown that they're committed, rather than simply wanting to make connection, make a job. So it's kind of paradoxical. If you're going for a job, you won't get one. If you're going for doing the work and then you're asking for a job, you will. So it's difficult because the whole issues around class and ethnicity and, you know, structural violence, and the fact that some people can afford to spend time doing stuff and others can't, and so on. So I'm not denying the reality of all that, but if you can actually show that you're committed to the area that you're interested in and have got on with that in some sort of way, that would be really helpful, really practical bit of advice. And of course, there are no unconventional career paths in anthropology. There's no single conventional career path. There's no unconventional one either.
I just want to jump in and say, I think a bit of sort of investigative research on LinkedIn to see kind of, to find basically people who have studied anthropology and what they do today. Obviously, today is a very good step in that. But I say that because I think it's useful to do it quite early on, because I think it sort of helps you tailor what courses to take at university as well. So I found that when I was doing my bachelor's in social anthropology, I had no idea what I wanted to do. And so I kind of just did what took my fancy, which, to be fair, I really enjoyed. So I did kind of anthropology of architecture, I did anthropology of gender, I did ethnographic film, and I enjoyed all of that. But maybe a bit of a sense of, this is kind of what I'd like the courses to sort of accumulate to or combine to at the end. Perhaps would have been a bit helpful to me.
I can come in. I think just, you know, we are anthropologists, so thinking about sort of everyone's different, and I guess the sort of advice I would give would really depend on people's situation and their sort of needs. I think the advice I would have given myself when I was 18 and setting off to South Africa is very different from the advice I needed when I was looking for a career change and had a baby and so on. So I guess I was much more sort of practically minded and much more strategic about my career, even thinking about it as a career in the last few years. And I was doing all of that stuff that has been mentioned about networking and going on LinkedIn and doing my research about sort of what gaps can I fill, how can I sell myself, and all of that. I think is really important. Like, absolutely feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll share afterwards. I've got a slide pack on how you can get into government social research. That's I think a really great career, and also just a good sort of experience under your belt, and you can move into lots of stuff afterwards with that. I think other kind of practical things I've found that having some hands-on experience, whether that be through an internship or the actual field work, I think is a very hands-on experience as well. That sort of things that shows an employer that you can sort of put all theoretical knowledge into practice, and that you know how to be in a workplace and work with other people. I think that's great if you can sort of get that in as part of your studies, perhaps. And I think the other thing, and I'm sorry to say, but I do think the sort of quant skills, just having that very basic knowledge that it's not a completely foreign planet that we don't understand anything about. I think that is quite an asset on the job market, that you have that basic understanding. But then again, like I think my 18, 19, 20-year-old self was just not at all interested in those things. It was just going with the passion, and it took me to really interesting places. And I've had a lot of fun in academia, and I think, you know, so on the other hand, there's also that if you're not constrained by like having a mortgage and a child and wanting certain material comforts or whatever, you know, I think go with your passion, because that's usually where your strengths are, and that's where you're going to succeed and be really good. So I think don't be shy to just kind of go for it. And I mean, I had suddenly this opportunity to work at the University of Oxford. I never had dreamt of in my life, and I just went for it, and I emigrated to the UK, and I'm still here after 15 years. So yeah, I'm happy to chat to anyone who wants to sort of reach out afterwards and hear more. But yeah.
My final advice, just to wrap up, was I plus want like everything that everyone said. I totally agree. It's great to emphasize the networking. Just to say something different, mildly different, is to just if you are a student, you're taking courses in anthropology, you're a recent graduate, like practicing ethnography and anthropology is like a muscle. Like you can apply it like everywhere and anywhere. And I think we talk about kind of how do you get that first experience or professional experience, or how do you get to do something? And like, I mean, I recently felt that I wasn't getting enough kind of ethnography, and took up a drawing class again and just treated that as a little ethnographic experimentation. And I think like, don't limit yourself by oh, I need to get an internship, or I need to like do something. Like, of course, echoing what Justin said, there's lots of practicalities, but at the same time, like ethnography and anthropology are something that can be, they're so integrated into our lives once you've kind of know what you're looking for, and the research practices, that you can kind of curate your own experience as well. And like it's all about the thinking and that mindset that you're bringing to conversations, and kind of challenging other people. So that would be one practical bit of like, don't limit yourself in that way. But also, career transitions come in all kinds of different forms. So even though we've structured this question in terms of students and recent graduates, like anyone at any point in time in your career can revisit kind of what does it mean? What does a career look like? How do I expand my network? What are other people doing in anthropology? And I just really feel like that's important to reinforce too.
Sorry, Veronica, we can't hear you.
To this is to say, be adventurous. The whole point of studying and doing research is to learn something new and to use your imagination to create new ways of thinking and new ways of doing. And so being adventurous is absolutely key, and anthropology provides many opportunities for that. But I'm going to stop us there because I know that Sophie will want to be creating our breakout rooms. I'm not sure if we all get together at the very end. So just in case we don't, I want to thank all of our panelists warmly for their very passionate input into this discussion, and to thank all of you for attending.